Welcome to the deep dive, where we take complex systems, strip away the narrative, and really try to understand the operating architecture underneath.
Today we're tackling something that I think for most people sounds incredibly bureaucratic.
It really does. Japan's special accounts, or STA?
And if you're hearing about special accounts, in the general media, it's almost always framed in this really negative way.
Oh,
You
absolutely.
hear phrases like mystery funds or slush funds.
Right, or something about historical darkness. It always suggests there's something intentionally being hidden.
Exactly. It suggests intentional opacity. And that's what we call the N layer, the narrative layer. It's always focused on scandal or hidden ledgers.
But that's not what we're here for. We want to do some structural engineering. We want to get underneath that and understand why they exist and how they actually function.
And that is the absolute core shift we need to make for this deep dive, which we're calling STA-1. We have to stop viewing these special accounts as just, another government wallet. If you really want to understand how a government operates, you should see them as internal management operating systems.
Operating systems, like software.
Precisely. They're like independent software modules, each one designed for a very specific government business unit.
So instead of thinking about where the money is, we should be thinking about the software architecture, the rules, the flowcharts, the logic that dictates how that money is managed.
You've got it. And this reframing is essential. When you look at it this way, a phenomenon like structural runaway, which we've talked about before as STA-0.
It sounds a lot like malfeasance.
It does, but through this lens, you can analyze it not as corruption, but as the historical hardening or calcification of these internal OS modules. They just get old and rigid.
I see.
So our mission today is to really map the architecture of this institutional OS. We're focusing purely on the structure and the function, the OS layer, and just setting aside all that political noise for now.
Oh. Okay, let's unpack that. If we're dealing with two different types of operating systems, what is the fundamental structural difference between the general account, the GOA, and the special accounts, the STA?
The differences are profound, and they are entirely structural. It really comes down to their purpose, their funding, how they're reviewed, and how rigid their spending rules are.
Okay, so let's start with the one people are more familiar with, the general account, the GOA.
Right. Think of the GOA as the integrated OS. This is like the main operating system on your computer, Mac OS, or Windows.
The big one that does everything.
It does everything. It's designed for overall national optimization. Its purpose is versatile. And crucially, the GOA is subject to this intense annual review by the Diet.
So it's always under a microscope.
Constantly, which keeps it dynamic, but also accountable on a very short time horizon. Its funding is mostly central tax revenue, which makes it what you'd call highly versatile funds.
And it's allocated by big policy areas like defense or education.
Exactly. Broad policy units.
So the GOA is the highly visible, highly scrutinized main engine. How does the STA contrast with that?
The STA is what we're calling the module OS. It's less like the main engine and more like a very specific, isolated piece of software.
Like an app.
Or maybe an enterprise resource planning module, an ERP, for just one department in a giant corporation. Its purpose is local optimization.
Local optimization, meaning it's not trying to solve everything for everyone.
Not at all. It's designed to maintain one specific continuous business flow, like running a national insurance program or managing public debt. It optimizes for its own mission, not for the national whole.
I see. So if the integrated OS is a generalist, the module OS is a specialist.
A deep specialist. Historically, STAs just grew as necessary tools for, internal management accounting for specific projects.
Yeah.
And their funding is the critical difference.
How so?
It's specific. It comes from fees or insurance premiums, user payments, certain bonds. And this leads to its single most defining structural trait, purpose lock-in.
Purpose lock-in.
The funds are rigidly tied to their source and their intended use. They aren't versatile at all. The OS, the software, will literally only allow that money to be used for the one business function it was created for.
That's a huge structural difference. Okay, this is where it gets really interesting for me. Why does the government even need these separate modules? If the goal is transparency and, national optimization, why not just run everything through the big central integrated OS, the general account?
That's the key question, right? And the answer is just the sheer complexity of modern state operations.
It's just too big.
It's too big and too varied. I mean, no massive enterprise, public or private, could run all of its diverse operations from a single generic cost center. Imagine trying to manage the long-term math of a national pension plan inside the same budget as, say, highway maintenance.
It would be a nightmare. The timescales are completely different.
Impossible. So structurally, the STA has to exist because certain government businesses need their own continuous cash flow and their own dedicated accounting just to function properly.
So it's a structural necessity. And you're saying it's kind of like how a big company works.
Yes. Structurally, an STA is basically equivalent to a profit center, or at the very least a revenue and expense center in private sector management accounting.
A self-contained business unit.
Exactly. It tracks its own performance, its own self-sufficiency. It's the national version of a business P&L, a profit and loss statement.
Yeah.
It manages its own dedicated money coming in and money going out.
That analogy makes it click instantly. So if we want to understand the architecture, we should be thinking ministry equals a business division.
Right.
The special account, the STA, is a specific business center inside that division.
Yep.
And the general account, the GOA, is like the HQ accounting department.
Precisely. That view captures the structural rationality perfectly. I mean,
Yep.
These highly specialized, sometimes revenue-generating or very long-term units like managing the national forests or employment insurance, they would break the central OS if you tried to force them into that mold. They just need their own rules.
Okay, but if this separation is rational and even necessary, how do you draw the line between that necessary complexity and the problems everyone talks about, like, a lack of transparency or waste?
And that is the critical distinction. This structural rationality, this natural complexity that forces these centers to form, that is the origin point for all the later systemic problems.
So the problems are unintended consequences of a necessary design.
They are. The seeds for what we later see as calcification, shear, and membrane tension are planted right here in this necessary separation of the OS layers. It's a design trade-off. You get efficiency and stability within the module, but you start to lose flexibility and integration with the central system.
Let's unpack that concept you just mentioned, shear. If these are different OS layers operating for different purposes, do they run at different speeds on different clocks?
They absolutely do. And this difference in pace, we're calling OS speed or shear, is maybe the most disruptive structural difference of all.
Okay.
The general account, the GOA, it operates as a fast OS. It is aggressively driven by the annual fiscal cycle.
Right, the yearly budget battle.
The yearly budget battle. It forces constant review, adaptation, zero-sum budgeting, all within a 12-month window. It has to be fast.
That makes perfect sense. Everything has to be accounted for and defended every single year.
But the special account, by contrast, operates as a slow OS. It has to. It's structurally bound to long-term, continuous, multi-year operations. It's managing funds that build up over decades, like sinking funds or generational insurance pools.
So the root of a lot of these systemic issues isn't bad intent, but a fundamental design constraint. It's a clash in the clock speed between the integrated OS and the module OS.
Precisely. This difference in pace, this shear, this slippage between the layers, is the starting point for what we call compatibility errors between the fast GOA and the slow STA.
They're just not built to talk to each other properly.
They operate on different timescales. They have incompatible requirements for how to manage money. It's almost like trying to run, highly specialized engineering software on a general office operating system. It just doesn't compute.
Can you give us a concrete example? A special account that is forced to be a slow OS just because of what it does.
A perfect one is the National Debt Special Account. Its main job is the long-term, multi-generational management of government bonds.
Right. Interest payments, refinancing.
All of it. This account operates as an automatic stabilizer OS for the whole financial sector. You simply cannot manage a 30-year bond repayment schedule on an annual budget cycle.
The math just doesn't work.
The structural math does not fit the GOA's annual clock. It has to have stability, it has to accumulate funds over the long term, which forces it to operate slowly. If that slow OS tried to comply with the fast OS's yearly demands, the stability needed for national debt management would just collapse.
It's a feature, not a bug.
In that context, yes. Or take the Energy Countermeasures Special Account. It's funded by the oil tax and it finances energy security policies. We're talking decades-long infrastructure investments, strategic reserves.
You can't budget for that on a whim every year.
You can't. Because the function is inherently long view, the structure must be slow. This slowness is a structural requirement. It is not an accounting choice.
Okay, this clarifies why the separation is necessary. But what happens then? If these self-contained business centers are running autonomously and slowly, what happens when the fast central GOA tries to interact with them? Where does that shear, that friction, actually show up?
It shows up at the boundary, and we call that boundary the membrane.
The membrane.
Think about it. Any business unit that gets its own autonomy naturally forms a boundary, a membrane between itself and the rest of the organization. For an STA, because its OS has that purpose lock-in and its own funding, this boundary hardens over time.
Hardens how? Is that like legal resistance or just people refusing to open the books?
It can be both, but it's primarily the hardening of operational rules and historical precedent. This hardening increases what we call membrane tension at the interface with the general account.
So an example would be if the Ministry of Finance, which is acting as the GOA, tries to, say, audit or take surplus funds from a specific STA. The STA will often resist. It'll cite its own unique founding laws, its specific accumulation rules, or its historical long-term commitments.
And that resistance is the membrane tension.
That legal and procedural resistance is the tension. It's the result of two competing OS architectures colliding at their boundary. The fast OS wants flexibility. The slow OS demands stability.
And that tension is what causes the problems.
Precisely. This tension causes the structural deviations, the precursor to those compatibility errors. It explains the fragmentation you see between ministries, because each autonomous business OS is prioritizing its own local optimization.
Just running its own business successfully.
Exactly. Over central integration and budget flexibility.
You know, this fundamentally shifts what we should even be looking for when we say we want transparency.
It really does.
It's not about finding some hidden ledger in a back room. It's about mapping the rules of the OS architecture itself.
That is the essential insight. True transparency is not just publishing raw numbers. It is reading the system's architecture. When you see the STA as an OS, the crucial points to analyze become really clear.
What are they?
To understand how any specific business center operates, you have to look at three structural points. First, funding fixedness. How specific and rigid is its income? Second, purpose lock-in. How legally restricted is its spending? And third, the interface, the membrane. How resistant is it to outside intervention?
Understand those three things.
And you can transparently read the institutional OS architecture.
We started this deep dive with special accounts being framed as this, historical black box,
Right.
Something intentionally mysterious.
And I think we can end with a different understanding.
Yeah.
Special accounts shouldn't be seen as proof of corruption or some kind of historical darkness. They are fundamentally legacy OS modules.
Legacy side.
Exactly. Their lack of immediate transparency isn't usually due to active malicious concealment. It's primarily because of structural hardening and, frankly, decades of delayed OS updates. It is an issue of OS architecture and systemic engineering.
And that systemic view, it shifts the problem entirely. It goes from a political question of who is hiding what to a structural engineering challenge of how do we modernize the system. That's a huge reframing for anyone trying to learn about this.
It is. And this foundation that we've called STA-1, this structural map of the OS, it allows us to analyze the next, and maybe the most visible phenomenon, without getting lost in all the narrative noise.
So what is the next structural challenge that comes out of this architecture?
The next logical step is to analyze fund calcification. We'll call that STA-2.
Calcification.
This is where these necessary internal modules, through historical accumulation, their legal protections, a lack of compatibility updates, they become rigid, often unmanageable. Sometimes they accumulate funds that far, far exceed what they actually need for their operations.
So if the structural hardening we talked about today is the cause,
Calcification is the highly visible symptom. And that is where the problems of the slow OS become truly acute.